the Court of Appeals, a decision a little while ago, said that the doctrine of prime necessity is no longer in force in New Zealand. Why? It had been superseded by the Commerce Act, because the Commerce Act provides for flexibility in pricing. So a provider of a service has flexibility in what price it wants to set. So what was negated here? Notions of reasonableness, reasonable pricing, and the public interest. Did the judges behave unethically in reaching this decision? I would say no. Why? Well, judges have a duty. You have a statutory law. The statutory law supersedes the common law. The judge has the duty to apply the law as it exists. The statute says flexibility in pricing. It doesn't matter what the common law says. What matters is what Parliament says. And Parliament has communicated what it wants to do via the Commerce Act. All right, so the judges didn't behave unethically, but what about the legislators? Did members of Parliament behave unethically by passing the Commerce Act? Whether or not they behaved unethically depends on the ethical reference we're working with. So we have to ask ourselves, are we working with individual ethical references? Is there a collective ethical reference? If we can't point to a collective ethical reference, presumably it's based on individual ethics. And then that brings in other questions about whether or not politicians should be basing decisions that apply to the collective based on their own personal ethics. And that brings up questions of representative democracy which fall outside the scope of today's talk. But it does raise questions as to where do ethics figure in the law and development debate. According to former Chief Justice of the American Supreme Court, Earl Warren, without ethics, there is no law. His words. Without ethics, there is no law. The exact quote, if I remember, without ethics, law could not exist. So ethics precede law. Before we have law, we have ethics. But today, many people are turning to religion for their ethics. They did so historically. There was a period in the 20th century where they ceased to do so, and these days we see an increase in religiosity. Ready-made ethical code. Okay, fine. Many others, however, are not turning to religion and instead are turning to law and legal initiatives. So this comes from the belief that law can be used to redress injustices. Okay? Poor countries need the rule of law as a way to deal with corruption. Imperial powers need law as a way to avoid the transgressions that they do, as a way to keep them in check. So they need human rights. They need the law of war. Fragmented nations need constitutional reform as a way to bring people together, as a way to help them get along. In all of these instances, we're using law as a way to reform these societies. And my impression is that this is not particularly effective. And one can point to Yugoslavia to see how a prominent failure of the law and development, or the rule of law, or the good governance models. Malcolm X said that goodwill cannot be legislated. Goodwill cannot be legislated. What we're doing here is putting the cart before the horse. If social vision precedes law, as Trubeck tells us, if ethics precede law, as Justice Warren tells us, then law cannot be a reform in of itself. Law is a vehicle via which a social vision, a certain ethical code is circulated. Which begs the question, what precedes social vision? What precedes ethics? You could phrase it another way and say, what are social visions or ethics established on? How are these built? How are they crafted? We turn to Malcolm X again for the answer. Goodwill cannot be legislated. It is attained through education. So education is the key. Education is the answer to what we're doing here today. Not exactly. The type of education one acquires is critical. So what do law students, future law and development practitioners, learn about ethics? Well, if we go by the degree alone, the answer is probably not very much. In 4 years, there's one mandatory 10-point ethics paper. In 4 years. But if ethics precedes law, then why isn't more time spent on learning about ethics if one is to become a lawyer or a law development practitioner? Ken Robinson, a prominent educational theorist, tells us we can observe in educational systems, he's describing educational systems today, methods that kill critical thinking and reinforce rote learning. So no need to trouble yourself, the ethics are in place. All that you have to do is work towards ensuring that these laws are followed. That's what law students learn. They learn how to apply the law. Now this is often the case with law and development. The model is in place, and it's merely the application of that model. So thinking today, for instance, of democracy. Democracy is the model. It doesn't matter what the society is. Democracy is progress. Democracy is development. I'm not questioning whether it is or not. I'm simply saying that that's the position. Notions of formal equality. I'm not valuing it and saying whether it's right or wrong, but that is the standard. The question is, why? Are we trying to understand why that standard is? How would societies look if they were different? Is it possible for some societies to function based on a different model? Maybe, maybe not, but that's not the question that we're looking at. So the problem as Gramsci saw it, the problem as Malcolm X saw it, the problem as Paulo Freire saw it, the problem as many third world revolutionaries saw it, is with education. According to Freire, there are two main types of education that young people have been receiving for the last several years, several decades. He says there's an education for integration and there's an education for emancipation. These are somewhat self-explanatory. Education for integration is one where young people, people in general, are integrated into the logic of the present system. They are rewarded for conformity. They are rewarded for obedience. They are rewarded for getting the right answer. Then you have education as a function or as the practice of freedom. And that is different. By providing young people via this emancipatory education with the tools, the ability to assess things critically, but more importantly, to assess things in a creative manner with the aim of transforming society. Not merely recreating it, but transforming it. And one thing that we can say is that to change society, whether it be for better or for worse, requires us to receive a critical, a creative education. So someone like Milton Friedman was very creative. There's no doubt about it. Someone like Pinochet, was extremely creative. Never found someone with so many ideas about torture. You change society, whether it's for better or for worse. One needs to be creative. Because it provides us with space to think innovatively about difficult questions. So in discussing law and development, or the future of law and development, or as Trubeck refers to it, this post-law and development period, he says to us that our commitment to emancipation must be unyielding. But our approaches should be flexible, and more flexible than they have been in the past. Now, law and development has primarily involved governments. It has primarily involved law. Law development. Primarily involved the market. Now these spheres imply certain logics. So with government, we're thinking the logic of command. With law, we're thinking about the logic of order. And with the market, I'm thinking about the logic of exchange. Law and development historically. And if we move into what Trubeck, if we follow what Trubeck, as I said, preeminent law and development specialist, is suggesting, and we move to this post-law and development period, well, this requires us to open up to additional spheres. And some of these spheres could be history, could be ethics, and it could be education. Put in brackets here, an emancipatory form of education. From government, law, and market, history, ethics, and education. We have history, then we're bringing in the logic of memory. We bring in ethics, we're bringing in the logic of morality. We move into education, we've got the logic of creativity. So if you were to take a moment and look at this, and look at law and development over the last few decades, with a focus on governments, on law, on markets, logic of command, and order, and exchange, and then looking at what is being suggested, when we move into this post-law and development period, where we look more towards history and ethics and education, with a concern for the logics of memory, morality, and creativity. The question that I have for you is, which logics do you think are more likely to help people achieve this much vaunted emancipation that development is meant to bring about? I'll leave it at that.